In the far reaches of northern Canada, where the wilderness stretches endlessly and the closest human settlement lies hours away, a solitary cabin stood resolutely against the elements. Its sturdy wooden frame had endured years of punishing winters, a lone outpost in a sea of ice and snow. Inside, Eric Hansen, a wildlife biologist by profession and a recluse by choice, stared out of a frost-covered window. The thermometer outside displayed an unrelenting temperature of -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the biting cold showed no signs of abating. Eric, now in his 7th year of living alone in this remote wilderness, had never experienced a cold so intense, not even during the harshest winters of his past. Eric's cabin wasn't just a home. It was a testament to his decision to escape the busyness of urban life. Once a university lecturer in Vancouver, he had traded classrooms and colleagues for isolation and the study of Arctic wolves, creatures that had fascinated him since childhood. His walls were adorned with photographs of majestic wolves he had captured on his many field trips. Each image represented hours of patient observation, a dedication to documenting the lives of one of nature's most enigmatic species. But tonight, as a fierce storm approached, Eric wasn't thinking about research or photography. His focus was entirely on survival. The wilderness around his cabin, though breathtaking in its beauty, was utterly unforgiving. Dense pine forests blanketed in thick snow surrounded the small structure, and the icy winds cut through the trees, howling like a symphony of anguish. The area's isolation was both a gift and a curse. It offered peace and solitude, allowing Eric to focus on his work, but it also meant that help was hours away should anything go wrong. And in conditions like these, the margin for error was razor thin. The morning had begun like many others. Eric woke early, as was his habit, and fed the fire in the stone fireplace that served as his primary source of warmth. Outside, the snow fell steadily, layering the landscape with a fresh coat of white. The cabin was insulated and well-stocked, a result of meticulous planning and years of living at the mercy of nature. Eric's survival routine was almost ritualistic. Every day, he checked his weather radio, inspected his supplies, and ensured his equipment was in working order. On this particular morning, the radio delivered grim news. A storm system was moving in, bringing record-breaking lows and hurricane-force winds. It would be a storm like no other, the kind that tested even the most experienced wilderness dwellers. Eric spent the rest of the day preparing. He secured his generator, adding extra insulation to its housing to prevent it from freezing in the frigid temperatures. He double-checked his stock of firewood, ensuring enough was stored indoors to last several days. He even wrapped additional layers of heat tape around his water pipes, knowing full well that frozen pipes could quickly lead to disaster in conditions like these. His father's words, spoken so many years ago, echoed in his mind. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's survival. Those words, simple yet profound, had guided Eric through countless challenges in the wilderness, and they were no less relevant now. As the afternoon gave way to evening, the storm began to roll in. The snow, which had fallen gently earlier, now lashed against the cabin in thick sheets, obscuring the world beyond the windows. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the winds screamed through the trees like a living entity. Eric lit additional lanterns inside, their soft glow creating a stark contrast to the darkness outside. He added more logs to the fire, the warmth spreading slowly through the cabin as he settled into his chair with a steaming cup of coffee. The storm's ferocity was unnerving, even for someone as seasoned as Eric, but he found comfort in the familiarity of his surroundings. Despite the brutal conditions, Eric couldn't help but think about the wolves he studied. These creatures, masters of survival, thrived in environments most humans couldn't endure. Their ability to adapt to the harsh Arctic conditions had always been a source of admiration for Eric. But even wolves, with their thick fur and unparalleled instincts, struggled during storms of this magnitude. Eric wondered if the wolves he had been tracking would find shelter in time, or if the storm would take a toll on their numbers. It was a thought that lingered in his mind as he watched the fire dance in the hearth. The wilderness, Eric often reflected, had a way of reminding people of their smallness. Here, surrounded by the vast expanse of snow and ice, human strength and ingenuity seemed insignificant in the face of nature's raw power. Yet it was this very insignificance that made the wilderness so alluring to Eric. It forced him to confront his vulnerabilities and find strength in preparation, resilience, and an unyielding respect for the land and its inhabitants. As the storm intensified, Eric knew that the night ahead would be one of vigilance and endurance. The temperature would drop even further, and the howling winds would continue to batter the cabin. But Eric was prepared, both mentally and physically. He had chosen this life, not because it was easy, but because it offered him a deeper connection to the world, a connection that, despite the isolation, made him feel profoundly alive. Little did he know, however, that this storm would bring an encounter that would test not just his survival skills, but his capacity for compassion and courage. The storm's ferocity peaked as midnight approached, the wind howling through the towering pines like the cries of unseen ghosts. Snow battered the cabin's windows with relentless force, rattling the glass and seeping cold into the edges of the wooden frame. Eric Hansen sat in his worn chair, the fire in the hearth crackling weakly as it fought against the icy grip encroaching on his sanctuary. He wrapped a blanket tighter around his shoulders, trying to stave off the growing unease that crept into his chest with each gust of wind. It wasn't just the storm. It was the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. Then it came, piercing through the storm's chaotic symphony, a low, mournful howl. Eric froze, the mug of coffee in his hand forgotten as his ears strained to catch the sound again. Another howl followed, this one closer, almost tangible in its despair. He had spent years in the wilderness, had heard the calls of countless wolves, but this was different. It wasn't a triumphant claim of territory or the call of a hunting pack. It was a cry of desperation, raw and haunting. He grabbed his flashlight and cautiously approached the window. The frost-covered glass blurred the world outside into an indistinct swirl of white and shadow. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned closer, trying to peer into the storm. The howling stopped, leaving only the relentless roar of the wind. And then he saw them. 3 shapes emerged from the storm, their silhouettes faint against the endless barrage of snow. Eric's heart pounded as the flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the unmistakable forms of an Arctic wolf and her 2 pups. Their pale fur blended almost seamlessly with the snow, but their movements betrayed them. The mother wolf staggered, her usual grace reduced to a labored shuffle. The pups stumbled behind her, barely able to stay upright against the punishing wind. Eric watched in stunned silence as they moved closer, their struggle evident in every step. He had seen wolves from afar many times, admired their resilience and beauty through the lens of his camera. But to see them like this, so close and so vulnerable, was unsettling. Something had driven them from their den, perhaps a collapse under the weight of the storm, or an attack from another predator. Whatever the reason, They were now exposed to the killing cold, and their chances of survival were slipping away with each passing second. The mother wolf lifted her head, her golden eyes catching the flashlight beam for a brief moment. Eric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her gaze wasn't wild or aggressive. It was something far more haunting, a mixture of exhaustion and determination, as though she understood her plight but refused to give up. She was fighting for her pups, and Eric could see that her strength was failing. The wolves reached the edge of his porch, their forms barely visible against the relentless snow. They huddled together, seeking what little shelter the cabin provided from the storm's fury. The pups trembled violently, their small bodies unprepared for such extreme cold. Eric felt his breath catch as he watched the mother wolf curl protectively around them, her body a fragile shield against the merciless wind. He knew the rules. Every instinct, every survival guide he had ever read, told him to stay inside. Wolves were dangerous, even in their weakened state. A desperate animal could lash out without warning. And yet, as Eric stood there, his hand gripping the doorframe, he felt an overwhelming pull to act. These weren't just animals. They were a family on the brink of death. His hand moved to the door handle almost without his consent. The wind roared louder as he pulled the door open, the cold biting into his face like 1,000 tiny needles. The mother wolf's ears twitched, her body tensing as she turned to face him. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Eric raised his hands slowly, his flashlight forgotten at his feet. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The mother wolf growled low in her throat, a warning that sent a shiver down Eric's spine. But she didn't move. Her golden eyes flicked to the blanket he held, then back to his face. Eric's heart pounded as he knelt down, placing the blanket just a few feet from the door. Slowly, he retreated, leaving the door to the storage room ajar. Minutes passed like hours as Eric watched from the safety of his cabin. The wolves didn't move at first, their exhaustion evident in their stillness. But then, the mother wolf nudged the blanket with her nose, testing it. She turned to her pups, nudging them gently until they began to stir. Eric held his breath as the mother wolf gathered her remaining strength and began guiding her pups toward the open door. The snow swirled around them as they crossed the threshold, the storm momentarily blurring their forms into ghostly shadows. Eric closed the door behind them, sealing out the cold and the chaos. For the first time that night, the cabin felt warm. But the warmth wasn't just from the fire. It was the flicker of hope that, even in the face of nature's unforgiving cruelty, compassion could still prevail. The cold air from the cracked door hit Eric like a punch to the chest. He hesitated, his hand trembling on the door handle, the storm outside a roaring monster that seemed determined to swallow anything that dared face it. The wolves were still there, huddled in a tight cluster just a few feet from the cabin, their forms half buried in the mounting snow. The mother wolf had wrapped herself around her pups, her powerful body trembling with exhaustion as the wind relentlessly tore at her fur. Eric could feel the frost creeping into his cabin, but it wasn't the cold that made him hesitate. It was the risk. Every survival rule he had learned screamed at him to stop. You don't bring wild animals, especially predators, into your space. You don't approach them. You don't open your door. Wolves, no matter how desperate, are still wolves. Even in their weakened state, a cornered animal could lash out. Eric knew the strength of an Arctic wolf, knew how quickly those jaws could snap bone if provoked, And yet, as he watched the small, fragile forms of the pups struggling to move against the snow, their shivers growing weaker, he felt a knot in his chest tighten. If he didn't act now, they wouldn't make it through the night. The mother wolf turned her head, her golden eyes locking onto Eric's. There was no aggression, no warning in her gaze. Instead, there was something far more haunting: resignation. It was as though she understood the odds, understood how close death was creeping. And in that moment, Eric saw a mother who had done everything in her power to protect her young and was running out of options. Her ears flicked back against her head, her posture tense but not threatening. And Eric realized something profound. She wasn't just protecting her pups from the storm, she was protecting them from him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he pulled the door open wider, the wind howling through the gap like an angry spirit. "It's okay," he whispered, though the words felt meaningless against the storm. "I'm not going to hurt you." The mother wolf's ears perked up slightly, her body unmoving, frozen like a coiled spring. Eric kept his movements slow and deliberate as he grabbed a heavy wool blanket and stepped outside. The cold was brutal, cutting through his thick coat like knives. The snow stung his face, and the wind roared so loudly he couldn't hear his own footsteps crunching in the snow. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he approached the wolves. He could feel the mother wolf's eyes boring into him, tracking every step. The pups, too weak to react, barely moved as Eric carefully laid the blanket on the ground a few feet away from them. He knelt, his breath clouding the air, and slowly slid the blanket closer with his gloved hands. The mother wolf growled, a low, guttural warning that sent a shiver down Eric's spine. He froze, his hands still, his body rigid. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "I'm just trying to help." He could feel the weight of her gaze, the tension in the air so thick it felt like it could snap. After what felt like an eternity, the growling stopped. Eric exhaled slowly, rising to his feet and backing away toward the cabin door. He left the storage room door open, a small beacon of warmth, spilling out into the frozen night. It was a gamble. If the wolves decided to move inside, they would have shelter. If not, they would likely freeze to death before dawn. Eric stepped back into the cabin, shutting the main door behind him and peering out through the frost-covered window. The mother wolf hadn't moved, her body hunched protectively over her pups. Her ears flicked toward the open door of the storage room, the warm air creating faint tendrils of mist in the cold. Eric held his breath, watching, waiting. Minutes passed like hours. The mother wolf finally shifted, nudging her pups with her nose. They stirred weakly, their movements slow and uncoordinated. She nudged them again, her strength visibly waning, but her determination unwavering. Eric's fingers dug into the windowsill. As he watched her rise, her legs trembling under her weight. Slowly, painfully, she began to move toward the open door, dragging the pups along the snow-covered ground. The blanket Eric had left acted as a crude sled, making it easier for the pups to move. Eric felt his chest tighten as the wolves inched closer to the storage room. The mother wolf's movements were deliberate, her focus unshakable despite her obvious exhaustion. The wind howled around her, snow swirling like phantoms in the dark, but she kept going. When they finally crossed the threshold into the warm space, Eric felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked him off balance. He stepped away from the window, his legs shaky, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He had done it. He had broken every rule of wilderness survival, taken a risk that could have gone disastrously wrong, and somehow it had worked. As he sank into his chair by the fire, Eric couldn't shake the image of the mother wolf's eyes, filled with both caution and trust. He knew the night was far from over, that there were still risks ahead, but for the first time in hours, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The storm raged on outside, its fury unabated, but inside the small cabin, a fragile truce between man and nature had taken hold. Eric Hansen sat quietly by the window, the frost on the glass muting the chaos beyond, watching the wolves huddled together in the small storage room attached to his cabin. The mother wolf lay curled around her pups, her large frame providing what warmth she could. Eric had never been this close to wolves before, not like this. It felt surreal to see them not as the majestic, untouchable creatures he had photographed from afar, but as vulnerable beings fighting to survive. The pups stirred weakly against their mother, their tiny bodies trembling from the lingering cold. Eric could see their breath, faint and slow, curling into the air like whispers. The mother wolf, though clearly exhausted, remained alert. Her golden eyes followed Eric's every movement through the small window that connected the storage room to the cabin. It wasn't a look of aggression. It was cautious, weary, and guarded, but there was no mistaking the flicker of trust that had begun to take hold. She hadn't attacked. She had brought her pups inside. In her own way, she had accepted his help. Eric busied himself, carefully preparing water and scraps of meat to leave by the door of the storage room. He moved slowly, deliberately, ensuring that his actions wouldn't startle the wolves. When he placed the offerings just inside the doorway, he noticed the mother wolf's ears perk slightly. She didn't move toward the food right away, but her gaze lingered on it. Eric retreated to the cabin, giving her space. It was a delicate balance, helping without overstepping, offering aid without stripping away the wild instincts that had kept her alive for so long. Hours passed, and the storm continued to howl. Eric watched as the mother wolf eventually rose, her movements careful and deliberate. She sniffed at the food and water he had left, then nudged one of the pups, encouraging it to drink. The little one responded, lapping at the water with hesitant, shaky motions. Eric exhaled deeply, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. One small step toward recovery, but it was enough to fill him with cautious hope. The next day, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Snow piled higher against the cabin, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the walls. Inside, however, warmth slowly crept back into the storage room. The pups, though still weak, moved with more energy. Eric smiled as he watched them wobble on their tiny legs, trying to play in the limited space. Their tails wagged faintly, their movements growing steadier as the hours passed. It was a simple thing, but it stirred something deep in Eric, a reminder of the resilience of life, even in the harshest conditions. The mother wolf remained a vigilant presence. She nuzzled her pups, guiding them gently, her every action a reflection of her unwavering devotion. Eric couldn't help but admire her. Despite her own exhaustion, she prioritized her pups, putting their needs above her own. She was a survivor, a protector, and watching her filled Eric with a deep respect that went beyond his years of studying wildlife. By the second night, Eric felt a connection forming. He didn't dare approach too closely, but the wolves no longer flinched at his presence. The mother wolf would watch him, her golden eyes steady but calm. She ate the food he left, always waiting until he had retreated, maintaining the distance that her instincts demanded. Eric respected that boundary, knowing it was what allowed her to feel safe. It was a strange partnership, one built on mutual caution and understanding, forged in the crucible of survival. When the storm finally began to wane, the change was almost imperceptible at first. The winds softened, the snow fell in lighter drifts, and for the first time in days, Eric saw a faint sliver of dawn breaking through the clouds. Inside the storage room, the wolves were different too. The pups had regained their strength, bounding around the space with curious, playful energy. Their mother watched them, her posture more relaxed, her movements surer. She was healing, just like they were. Eric prepared for the next step, knowing it was time. The wolves couldn't stay. As much as he had come to care for them, they belonged in the wild, not in the confines of his cabin. He opened the outer door to the storage room, letting the crisp morning air flood in. The mother wolf rose, her ears twitching as she scented the fresh snow. She nudged her pups, guiding them toward the open door. They hesitated for only a moment before bounding outside, their small bodies disappearing into the white expanse. The mother wolf lingered at the threshold, her powerful frame silhouetted against the morning light. She turned her head, meeting Eric's gaze one last time. In her eyes, he saw something that took his breath away, a quiet acknowledgement, a gratitude that transcended words. Eric nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. Then, with a graceful movement, she followed her pups into the wilderness, leaving behind only tracks in the snow. As Eric stood there, the cabin silent once more, he realized how deeply the experience had touched him. He had offered the wolves a chance to survive, but they had given him something too, a reminder of the fragile beauty of life and the unspoken bonds that connect all living things. It wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a shared moment of trust, one that would stay with him forever. When the storm finally broke, the world outside Eric Hansen's cabin was unrecognizable. The once familiar wilderness had been transformed into a glistening expanse of snow and ice. The trees were weighed down with heavy, sparkling branches, and the ground was buried under drifts so deep that only the tallest rocks and shrubs peeked through. The air was crisp, clear, and still, eerily quiet after days of roaring winds. Eric stood at the window, staring out at the pristine landscape. The storm had passed, but its ferocity was evident in every snow-laden surface. Inside the storage room, however, a different kind of transformation had taken place. The wolves had survived. Eric had spent days tending to them, watching over them as they gradually regained their strength. The two pups, who had been barely moving when they arrived, were now a bundle of energy. Their soft white fur had fluffed back up, no longer matted with ice and snow. They chased each other around the small space, playfully tumbling over one another, their tiny yips of joy a sharp contrast to the silence outside. Eric couldn't help but smile as he watched them. The sight was infectious, pure, unrestrained life, and it filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. The mother wolf, ever vigilant, had also changed. Her golden eyes, once dim with exhaustion, now gleamed with clarity and purpose. Though she still kept a watchful eye on Eric, her body language was calmer, less guarded. She moved with a renewed strength, standing tall and proud as she watched her pups. Eric marveled at her resilience. She had endured the brutal storm, protected her young, and now she was ready to lead them back into the wild. It was a testament to her indomitable spirit, and Eric felt privileged to have witnessed it. But Eric knew this moment couldn't last forever. As much as he had come to care for the wolves, he understood that they didn't belong here. This small room, with its warmth and safety, was only a temporary refuge. The wilderness was their home, and the time had come for them to return to it. Eric felt a pang of sadness at the thought, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of pride. He had done what he could, and now it was up to them to thrive on their own. The morning sun shone brightly, casting long shadows across the snow as Eric opened the outer door to the storage room. A rush of fresh, cold air swept in, and the wolves froze for a moment, their ears perking up. The pups were the first to react. They sniffed the air, their tiny noses twitching as they caught the scents of the forest beyond. One of them let out a small bark and bounded toward the door, only to stop and look back at its mother. Eric chuckled softly. Even in their newfound excitement, they still sought her guidance. The mother wolf rose gracefully, her powerful frame silhouetted against the light streaming in through the open door. She nudged her pups forward, her movements gentle but firm, guiding them toward the threshold. The pups hesitated briefly, their tiny bodies quivering with both excitement and uncertainty. But with another nudge from their mother, they stepped outside, their paws sinking into the deep snow. They bounded forward, their playful energy propelling them through the drifts as though the storm had never touched them. Eric watched from a respectful distance, his heart swelling as he saw them venture further into the wilderness. The mother wolf followed, her strides purposeful and strong. She paused at the threshold, turning back to look at Eric. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, Eric felt an unspoken connection pass between them. It wasn't gratitude in the way humans expressed it, but it was something just as powerful. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the role he had played in their survival. Eric nodded slightly, his chest tightening with emotion. Then, with a final glance, the mother wolf turned and followed her pups into the snowy expanse. Eric stood in the doorway, watching as their forms grew smaller and smaller, until they disappeared into the trees. The tracks they left behind were the only evidence of their presence, a fleeting reminder of the extraordinary bond they had shared. For a long while, Eric remained there, staring out into the wilderness. The cabin was quiet once more, the echoes of the pups' playful yips fading into memory. Yet Eric didn't feel lonely. Instead, he felt profoundly connected to the world around him. Helping the wolves had reminded him of the shared threads that link all living things, the drive to protect, to nurture, to survive. As he returned to his cabin and lit a fire in the hearth, Eric reflected on the experience. It wasn't just about saving the wolves. It was about reaffirming his place in the intricate web of life that surrounded him. The wolves had taught him something he hadn't expected, that even in the harshest of environments, compassion and courage could create a ripple effect of hope and resilience. That day, Eric sat by the window, watching the sun melt the snow from the tree branches. He knew he might never see the wolves again, but he didn't need to. Their memory, their resilience, and their trust had left an indelible mark on his heart. The wilderness was vast and untamed, but it was also full of connections waiting to be made. And Eric was grateful to have been part of one that would stay with him forever. The experience with the Arctic wolves left Eric Hansen with a profound sense of awe and reflection. As the days turned into weeks, he often found himself gazing out the frost-covered window of his cabin, replaying the encounter in his mind. The storm, the desperate cries of the mother wolf, the delicate balance between trust and fear. It all felt like something out of a dream. But it wasn't a dream, it was real, and it had fundamentally shifted how Eric viewed the world around him. For years, Eric had approached his work with a clinical detachment. As a wildlife biologist, his job was to observe, document, and study the natural world without interfering. He had always believed that nature should be left to its own devices, that the role of humans was to admire its beauty and respect its independence. Yet, as he sat by the fire, the memory of the wolves came rushing back. Their shivering bodies, the mother wolf's exhausted but determined gaze, and the fragile bond that had formed between them. It was a moment that challenged everything Eric thought he knew about the relationship between humans and animals. What struck Eric most was the mother wolf's silent plea. Her golden eyes had spoken volumes, conveying not just desperation, but also an unspoken understanding. She had chosen to trust him, despite every instinct warning her otherwise. That trust was not given lightly, and Eric recognized the weight of it. In those critical moments, it wasn't science or survival guides that had guided his actions. It was compassion. The wolves had needed help, and Eric had responded. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't even something he had planned. It was a simple, instinctive decision to do what felt right. And in doing so, Eric realized that compassion wasn't just a human trait. It was universal, a thread that connected all living beings. The mother wolf had demonstrated it in her tireless efforts to protect her pups, and Eric had mirrored it by opening his door to them. The bond they had shared, though fleeting, was rooted in that shared understanding. Eric's mind often wandered to that moment when the mother wolf had looked back at him before disappearing into the wilderness with her pups. It was a gaze that carried gratitude, resilience, and something deeper, a recognition of their shared vulnerability in the face of nature's unforgiving power. It was a reminder that survival wasn't just about enduring the elements. It was about connection, about finding strength in moments of unity and understanding. The encounter also rekindled something in Eric that he hadn't felt in years: purpose. He had dedicated his life to studying Arctic wolves, to understanding their behaviors and habitats. But this experience had given his work new meaning. It wasn't enough to observe from a distance anymore. Eric felt a deep responsibility to advocate for these creatures, to share their stories with the world, and inspire others to see them not as distant, untouchable figures, but as beings deserving of empathy and respect. Over the following months, Eric began documenting the encounter in his journal, not as a scientific report, but as a heartfelt narrative. He wrote about the storm, the moment he opened the door, and the fragile trust that had formed between him and the wolves. The act of writing felt cathartic, a way to process the emotional weight of the experience and to honor the connection he had shared with them. Eric also found himself sharing the story with others, friends, colleagues, and even strangers he met during his occasional trips to town. Each time he recounted the tale, he saw the same expressions of wonder and curiosity light up their faces. People were moved, not just by the wolves' struggle, but by Eric's decision to intervene. It was a story that resonated, a reminder of the profound impact even small acts of kindness could have. The experience also deepened Eric's appreciation for the wilderness. The Arctic, with its harsh conditions and untamed beauty, was a place of extremes. It could be both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. But within that duality lay its magic, a constant reminder of life's fragility and resilience. Eric realized that his role wasn't just to study this environment, but to protect it, to ensure that the creatures who called it home could continue to thrive. As Eric sat in his cabin, watching the snow fall gently outside, he felt a renewed sense of connection to the world around him. The wolves had given him more than just a story to tell. They had given him a lesson, in humanity. They had shown him that love and compassion weren't limited by species or circumstance. They were universal, binding all living beings together in a shared journey of survival and growth. In the end, Eric understood that his encounter with the wolves was more than an extraordinary event. It was a turning point. It reminded him that every decision, no matter how small, carried the potential to create ripples of impact. By choosing to help the wolves, Eric had not only saved their lives, but had also reawakened a part of himself he thought he had lost. The part that believed in the power of connection, the part that saw the beauty in vulnerability. And so, as the Arctic sun set behind the snow-covered horizon, Eric smiled. The wolves were gone, but their memory remained, etched into his heart. They had reminded him of something he would carry with him forever, that even in the harshest of environments, compassion could shine brighter than any storm. For Eric Hansen, life in the wilderness had always been about observation, watching from a distance, studying the intricate behaviors of Arctic wolves, and documenting their lives in quiet isolation. But the storm, the wolves, and the choice he made to intervene had changed something fundamental within him. What had once been a solitary pursuit of knowledge had transformed into a deeply personal mission. Eric no longer saw himself as just a scientist cataloging data. He had become an advocate, a voice for creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. The encounter had planted a seed of passion in Eric, a passion to share what he had learned, not just through research papers or academic conferences, but with the world at large. He realized that the story of the wolves wasn't just about survival. It was a reminder of the unbreakable connections between humans and nature, of how compassion could transcend the boundaries of species, and he was determined to make that message heard. It began with a single essay. Late one evening, as the snow fell softly outside his cabin, Eric sat at his desk and began to write. His words flowed freely, recounting the night he had opened the door to the wolves and the lessons they had taught him about trust, resilience, and the shared struggle for survival. Unlike his scientific writings, this essay was raw and emotional, capturing not only the details of the storm, but the profound impact the experience had left on his heart. When he finished, Eric sent the essay to a wildlife conservation magazine, unsure of how it would be received. To his surprise, the story resonated far beyond what he had imagined. Readers wrote letters, sharing how moved they were by the wolves' fight for survival and Eric's willingness to help. The magazine invited him to write more, to share his insights, not just as a scientist, but as someone who had lived through an extraordinary moment of connection with the natural world. Eric began writing regularly, his stories blending the beauty and harshness of the Arctic with the universal values of empathy and stewardship. But writing wasn't enough. Eric wanted to do more, to take action beyond the confines of his cabin. He reached out to wildlife conservation organizations, offering to speak about his experiences and the critical importance of preserving wild spaces. His talks were unlike traditional lectures. They were vivid, heartfelt narratives filled with imagery of snow-laden landscapes, the howl of the wolves, and the fragile balance of life in the Arctic. Audiences were captivated, not just by the science, but by Eric's genuine passion. He wasn't simply delivering facts, he was sharing a deeply personal connection, and it inspired people to care. Eric also began using his photography in new ways. For years, his photographs of wolves had remained largely unseen, tucked away in albums or displayed in small exhibits. Now, he brought them into the spotlight. He curated a traveling exhibition, pairing his images with excerpts from his essays, creating a multi-sensory experience that drew visitors into the world of the Arctic wilderness. Each photograph told a story: a lone wolf standing against a backdrop of endless snow, a pack silhouetted under the pale light of the northern moon, or the cautious gaze of a mother wolf shielding her pups. The exhibition toured cities across North America, sparking conversations and raising funds for conservation efforts. Perhaps the most transformative part of Eric's journey was the shift in how he viewed his own role. He began mentoring younger biologists and nature enthusiasts, encouraging them to see the world not just as a subject of study, but as a shared home. He taught them that science and emotion didn't have to be at odds, that understanding and caring could go hand in hand. His words carried weight because they were rooted in experience, in the memory of golden eyes meeting his through a snowstorm. As Eric's work gained momentum, he found himself connecting with a broader community of people who shared his passion. From school children eager to learn about wolves to policymakers seeking advice on environmental protections, Eric's voice became a bridge between worlds. He advocated for wildlife corridors, fought against the encroachment of industry into sensitive habitats, and campaigned for the preservation of Arctic ecosystems. Each step was driven by the memory of the wolves and the silent trust they had placed in him. Through it all, Eric never forgot the night when it all began. The storm, the open door, the fragile bond. It had been a moment of transformation, not just for the wolves, but for himself. He often thought about the mother wolf and her pups, imagining them thriving in the wild, their lives a testament to resilience and survival. They had given him more than a story to tell. They had given him a purpose. Years later, Eric stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people at a wildlife conservation event. As he spoke about the wolves, about the storm, and about the lessons he had learned, he saw the same spark of connection light up in their eyes. He ended his talk with a simple truth. Compassion isn't just about helping. It's about recognizing that we're all part of the same fragile world. And when we choose to care, we create ripples that can change everything. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Eric's thoughts drifted to the wilderness he called home. As he returned to his cabin that evening, he sat by the fire, watching the snow fall once more. He smiled, knowing that his journey, like the wolves, was far from over. Together, they had forged a connection that would inspire countless others, a reminder that even in the harshest places, compassion could thrive.